Good afternoon, and welcome to the Maine Agricultural Trade Show session on solar development and agriculture, the potential opportunities and impacts. My name is Tom Gordon, and I work in the Commissioner's Office of the Maine Department of Agriculture, Conservation, and Forestry on soil and water conservation policy and programs, soil health advocacy, and climate change adaptation. There's a lot of excitement around development of clean solar energy projects. Renewable energy development is a key component of our state climate action plan, which was just revealed on December 1st. Within the department, our Natural Areas Program has been flooded with environmental review requests for potential utility scale solar projects. If you're a farmer, you've probably had some contact by solar developers about options to lease your land for potential solar development. In this session, we're going to learn more about trends in solar development in Maine, the resources that are available to evaluate the siting of solar projects, and how government, agricultural interests, and solar developers are working together to try to balance renewable energy development with agricultural production and natural resource conservation. With us today are Ellen Griswold of Maine Farmland Trust, Holly Noyes, a solar project developer with Revision Energy, Nancy McBrady, the Agriculture Bureau Director in the Department of Agriculture, Conservation, and Forestry, and Dan Burgess, who is the Director of the Governor's Energy Office. Now, this is intended to be an interactive session. If you've been at the Ag Trade Show, you've seen the Hoover platform that we're using. Please put your questions and comments for our speakers in the Q&A or chat boxes on the right side of your screen. We'll get to as many of them as we can at the end of the presentations. And remember, the Ag Trade Show platform will be available into June for ongoing discussions with our speakers and attendees. So you'll have opportunities for extended Q&A, meetups, and looking at the presentation materials that are going to be included on the page. So now let's begin with Dan Burgess from the Governor's Energy Office. Dan, welcome.
Thanks so much. I appreciate the introduction and the opportunity to be a part of this panel. So I'm Dan Burgess. I'm the director of the Governor's Energy Office. Our office is the primary advisor to the governor on energy policy, and we work closely with the legislature and our sister agencies and regulatory bodies to work on energy policy. I just on a personal note, I'm originally from central Maine, where I grew up on what was once a small dairy farm, 80 to 100 cows, and now is a Christmas tree farm. And so I'm glad to be here in my role, but I'm also glad to be among so many other folks in the agricultural community. So thank you for having me.
Dan, could you boost your volume a little bit? Either. All right, thank you.
Great. So why don't we go to the next slide? So the governor has, since coming to office, has prioritized combating climate change and increasing the amount of clean energy in Maine. And that's been done through a few ways. So I'm going to be going through just giving a high-level overview of where policies in Maine are, and happy to have a more detailed conversation about some of the nuances throughout them. But overall, the state has set in statute a 45% reduction in greenhouse gas emissions from 1990 levels by 2030, and an 80% reduction by 2050. And the governor's also set a target to achieve carbon neutrality by 2045, an executive order. And one of the ways that this was done was by not just kind of creating the goals and mandates, but by creating what has been discussed earlier, but a climate council to help put together a climate action plan, a 4-year plan about how Maine can begin to meet those objectives and those targets. So if we go to the next slide, that At the same time, we've also taken really significant steps in the energy space, and to move forward to begin to meet those targets. The first is the doubling of our what it's called a renewable portfolio standard. So that is the amount of electricity that is to be provided from our electric utilities. That has gone from 40% and will go to 80% by 2030. So 80% of the electricity that Maine people and businesses receive by 2030 will come from renewable energy. We've advanced solar policies, which we'll talk a little bit more about, have moved forward on other areas like offshore wind, and we are actively working on embracing electrification opportunities in both the heating and the transportation sectors. Maine is the most heating oil dependent state in the country, and so there's a real opportunity to diversify the heating sector. And one of the ways that we're moving forward on that is through the incentives of um, high efficiency heat pumps. Is that better? Okay, you can hear me a little bit better. All right, next slide. Sorry, other way. So if you look at where Maine's emissions come from, over half of them come from the transportation sector, 19% from the residential sector, 11 commercial, industrial is 9%, and then actually the electric sector is the lowest of that pie at just 7%. But as we seek to electrify and make progress electrifying the transportation and heating sector, we need to make sure that we've got an electric system behind that is powered by clean energy. And so um, if you go to the next slide, the Climate Council looked at that and looked at each of these sectors and how Maine can make progress, and made a few different recommendations. And I'm not going to spend a ton of time going through each one. The report and plan, there's a lot of information online, which I would encourage folks to look at. But um, related is embracing the future of transportation in Maine, modernizing Maine's buildings, and then reducing the amount of carbon emissions that come from the electricity sector. And so solar is one of the key ways in which we're going to do that. If you go to the next slide, uh, you'll see that when we look at the modeling of kind of how we are to meet those, it's going to require, up top you can see, going from 3,000 to 4,000 electric vehicles that are currently on the road now to 40,000 in 5 years. We're going to need to double the amount of weatherization that we're doing in the state, the pace of that, reduce vehicle miles traveled, install more heat pumps. If you go to the next slide, modeling also shows that we're going to need to um, increase the amount of renewables that are on the grid, as I've been talking about. And in particular, you can see the middle areas there, that solar plays a really big part in that, with under 100 megawatts of solar installed in Maine right now. We are kind of have the least amount of solar installed in New England. Unsurprisingly, the correlation there is we also have the least amount of clean energy jobs per capita in New England. But you can see that the modeling shows that as we look to 2030 and what progress we need to make, we're looking at needing to install, somewhere along the line of 10 times what was installed when the governor came into office. So next slide. So again, the renewable portfolio standard is a common tool and a policy mechanism that states use to increase the amount of renewable energy. Maine actually now has the most ambitious RPS in New England with that 80%. You can see where that purple line on that top chart. That is for new renewable energy resources. So it's an exciting step forward. And one of the ways that we're effectuating that and meeting that policy is by issuing procurement opportunities uh, for clean energy resources. And in particular, this is driving larger scale resources, as Tom mentioned. So if you think about um, these bigger projects in the 100 megawatt total projects, those are being driven in large part by the renewable portfolio standard procurements. So the Public Utilities Commission ran a renewable energy procurement last summer, and the results came from that were 17 new renewable projects, or mostly new projects, and many of them solar. And then the second procurement was just issued last week for about half the amount of the prior procurement. So again, these are resulting in their larger scale resources being developed. Next slide. But if you look at kind of the smaller scale resources, again, there were less than 100 megawatts installed now. Modeling shows that we're going to need a significant amount of solar to meet our targets, and we're seeing a real significant amount of growth in solar at the kind of 5 megawatt and below range, which is 20 to, think about a 20 to 30 acre of land. That's a typo. It should be 5 megawatts is more like 800 to 1,000 homes. But these are kind of your smaller, what are called distributed resources. Those are being incentivized primarily right now through net energy billing, which allows customers to offset the electricity from the output of these smaller projects. It can be done through a tariff program, a direct credit program, or through community shared projects. And I think we can talk a little bit more about that. But overall, we are seeing the larger scale projects be developed because of the RPS, and these 5 megawatt and below projects being developed as a result of net energy billing. There was a distributed generation procurement that was conducted over the summer that did not end up moving forward. The still discussion as to how that fits in, but right now we're just seeing really significant development. And if you look at the map, I've mentioned kind of how much solar has been installed in Maine. If you look at the region, those darker spots is where there's more solar. And Maine is got a long ways to go to catch up with our neighbors who've been making investments here. And the regional grid operator estimates that we will have gone from roughly 3,000 megawatts of solar installed to more than double that in less than 10 years across the region. So this is a trend that's not just happening in Maine, but across New England. And if you look at the way our electricity is being generated, it is a significant change from 20 years ago and even 10 years ago when we had, 2010 had very little solar installed, and so our electricity system is changing, and so it represents a great opportunity for the state. And then finally, on the last slide, I just want to highlight that the Maine Won't Wait Climate Action Plan is available online, as Tom mentioned. But at the same time, we also released a Clean Energy Economy plan that outlines how we can not just get clean energy from these projects, but also there's a really big opportunity for workforce development, for career pathways and jobs. And I think importantly for both of these, it's an opportunity of when done right and done with citing considerations for farmers and those in the agricultural community to also benefit, whether it's hosting a project or being an off-taker for a project. So that is the high level. I think I'm probably at time, but I'm really happy to be here and happy to take further questions. So thank you.
Great, thank you, Dan. If anyone has any questions, please feel free to type them into the chat or Q&A portions on your screen. That should be on the right-hand portion of your screen. And we will answer questions at the end of the session. Next, we're going to move on to Nancy McBrady from the Bureau of Agriculture. Nancy.
The dreaded mute button, excuse me. Good afternoon, my name is Nancy McBrady. I am the Bureau Director for the Bureau of Agriculture, Food, and Rural Resources. And it's my pleasure to speak about the intersection of solar siting and agriculture here in the state. We have some interesting statistics to show you today, and then I'm going to go through some technical guidance opportunities and tools that may be of interest. So without further ado, let's segue over to my next slide, please. Okay, so as you can see here, basically, since the solar energy legislation of now 2 years ago, there has been a surge in the number of applications for commercial scale solar projects. And when I talk about applications, what I'm talking about here is the Maine Natural Areas Program, which is within the Department of Agriculture. This is a group of professionals who inventory land relative to endangered plants, natural resource ecosystems, and other type of outstanding examples of natural communities. They are also engaged in doing environmental site reviews for many types of projects, and are now looking at those that are coming in for solar. And so their statistics are quite interesting as it relates to what they saw for requests for environmental reviews back in 2019, which was 56. And then in 2020, which jumped to an astonishing 321. That is quite a large percentage increase. And also of note is the fact that 280 of those 321 solar projects that were submitted for review were over 20 acres. Next slide, please. And this is a basically graphical example, visual of what MNAP was looking at. So again, they look at all types of projects for review, solar, non-solar, and those that don't disclose the types of development. So that corresponds with the color coding here of the map. But if you can see the nuance difference, the crosses represent 2019 and the solid color circles for 2020. There's been a steady drumbeat of solar reviews by MNAP. By my review of this map, pretty much every single county in the state of Maine has had one presented, at least for a review. And of course, just looking at the greatest cluster, central and southern Maine really do look to be the areas of greatest potential interest. Next slide, please. It's worth also noting here that I do want to say, as much as MNAP has tracked these projects, there's a big asterisk next to them. Not all of these proposed projects will be built, excuse me, but it does underscore the interest in solar. And the reason being is because farmland is highly desirable, given its attributes. It tends to be largely cleared, flat, and oftentimes in large blocks, sometimes non-contiguous, but oftentimes quite contiguous. So in sum, as of 2020, 87% of the solar projects reviewed by the MNAP group intersected with mapped farmland soils, and about a little over 10,000 of which were impacted farmland soils in particular. So I'll dig into that in a moment, but it's worth my reviewing with you all what these types of soils are. Some of you might not be familiar. There are two types of farmland soils of interest in particular. First, there's prime farmland. And the definition I'll read is land that has the best combination of physical and chemical characteristics for producing food, feed, forage, fiber, and oilseed crops, and is also available for these uses. The land could be cropland, pasture land, rangeland, forest land, or other land, but not urban built-up land or water. It has the soil quality, growing season, and moisture supply needed to economically produce sustained high-yield crops when treated and managed. And then the sort of subset of that is called farmlands of statewide importance. They're not quite prime farmland, but they're close. And they can economically produce high yields of crops when treated and managed according to acceptable farming methods. So keep those two definitions in mind, prime and farmlands of statewide importance, as we go to the next slide, please. So again, data from our colleagues at MNAP for 2020, they basically broke down the solar projects, the 321 that we've talked about thus far. The total acreage involved for those solars included 43,000 acres of interest. The non-solar also include total acreage of 57,000. So, these are housing developments, industrial developments, et cetera. So there's certainly a lot of development that's still happening in the state relative to solar. But what is interesting, and I've already mentioned the 87% statistic, is that these solar projects as currently proposed intersect with farmland soils at a rate of 87%. Now, that's not from all four corners of the proposed project is farmland soils. That is not something that you should take away from. In fact, the total acreage then gets broken down further, that the total acreage of farmland soils of those 321 was in fact estimated to be 10,198. And then a subset of that is the prime farmland and the farmland of statewide importance. So those are still statistically relevant. I believe it's about 20% would be farmland. 9% would be farmland soils of importance, and 2.6 of prime farmland. Regardless, that is still farmland that can't be easily regenerated, and as I described in the definition, are very important for agriculture and forest related activities. Next slide, please. So let me segue from the statistical data to the department's broad policy views on solar development. So as these statements on the slide reflect, the department clearly recognizes that replacing fossil fuels with renewable energy sources that do not contribute to greenhouse gas emissions is desirable, and it is an objective for the state. And as we work to achieve greater renewable energy generation, it is still equally desirable to ensure that solar development does not negatively impact our state's agricultural and natural resources, including the types that are listed here on the slide: the productive farmland, timberland, rare plants, etc. Next slide, please. So again, the department also recognizes that solar energy production can provide economic benefit to landowners. That is certainly a given. And but there are also ways to maximize compatibility of multiple uses on certain sites. So to that end, we strongly encourage that commercial scale solar projects be sited on non-agricultural lands. Understand that the economics of that can sometimes be difficult, and that's worth discussing further. And further, when solar is developed on agricultural land, we are encouraging dual use solar projects. Again, the economics of that might be challenging, but it is something that we would like to advocate for. And in terms of non-agricultural lands for consideration, those would be parking lots, closed landfills, brownfield sites, etc. Next slide. So at the top, I talked a little bit about the guidance that we can provide as a department, and really want to point everyone, if they're not already aware, to two practical documents that we've issued back in 2020. The first is a document that's with respect to determining prime farmland soils and soils of statewide importance for siting solar projects. So what does that all mean? This was important for us to issue because the PUC's procurement announcement for prospective energy project bidders requires that those bidders demonstrate whether the project is located on land containing prime farmland or soils of statewide importance. And there was a dearth of information on how to do exactly that. So this guidance was created by our soil scientist who has recently retired, and also with the input of the Natural Resources Conservation Service. In October, we issued different guidance. This is guidance for commercial solar installation and development on agricultural, forested, and natural lands. And this is a pretty comprehensive guidance document in that it has two audiences. It's for farmers and landowners, and we want to provide them all with practical information when first considering solar development on their property, as well as considerations about pre-construction, construction, and post-construction. But then the other audience as well is for solar developers. Similarly, when designing, installing, and removing solar projects, but there's a lot of information in there about best practices. I do want to mention that the Maine Natural Areas Program does continue. They keep on trucking, reviewing those projects. and they are coordinating the sharing of information between agencies and other parties so that we're all up to date with what the level of interest is that they're tracking. And we also have staff within the department who are very knowledgeable about solar, what's happening in the landscape today. And if anyone ever has any questions, we certainly encourage them to reach out to us. Next slide, please. And here's an example of our recent solar resource webpage that went live a couple months back. It includes links to those guidance documents that I just talked about, and then also to a host of other resources that are available, whether by our partners such as Maine Farmland Trust, some of their guidance is up there as well, to national websites and other authoritative areas of information about solar development. So we hope that it is of value to people who want to start out and get smart about solar development in Maine. And that's the website address at the bottom. And with that, final page, that's my contact information if you go to the next slide. And as I mentioned, our webpage does list our staff who are available to answer questions too. So with that, look forward to answering questions at the end of all of this. And thanks for being able to impart what the Department of Ag is doing about this.
Great. Thank you so much, Nancy. If anyone is interested in the documents that Nancy mentioned, and you are on the Ag Trade Show Whova app, you can scroll down to the bottom of your screen and you'll see a series of downloads from Nancy and other people who are speaking today. So feel free to do that at your convenience. And again, put your questions in the Q&A or chat boxes, and we'll get to those at the end. Next, we will turn to someone who's been very busy with solar development projects, Holly Noyes. Welcome, Holly. The screen is yours.
Thank you, Tom. Hi, everyone. My name is Holly Noyes, and I work for Revision Energy. We are located here in Maine, as well as offices in New Hampshire and Massachusetts. We've been in Maine for the last 18 years, and we've certainly seen solar policy change during that time. We work with all different customers, so whether that's a large business, a town, a nonprofit, schools, and homeowners, we are working with all different groups here in Maine, New Hampshire, and Massachusetts as well for electric vehicle chargers, batteries, for solar, and heat pumps too. Just on a personal note, I've been with Revision Energy for the last 5 years, and I've been working with landowners to really partner with them and figure out where solar can work to help host community solar farms. I grew up here in Maine, in Albion, in fact, on a dairy farm, and continue to help out on the dairy farm today. So I am very keen on helping landowners with their solar projects and making this work for everyone involved. We have a virtual booth here today at the trade show, so I'd encourage you to check out the many great resources our team has put together there, and we're also available to chat there in the coming weeks and months if this is still available. And today I'm going to touch on different considerations for landowners who are evaluating hosting a solar farm. I'm also going to share a few examples on working with farms and how they're integrating this into their current business operations. Next slide, please. So there are a number of siting conditions that apply in order for a solar project to work. And in the early stages, it's very important to pay attention to these factors about your parcel of land specifically. And that's really to ensure that there's a path to development and one that makes sure that your goals are met too. So first, it's good to check with the zoning in your local town or city and see if there's any restrictions or any road bumps that you need to get around in order for a project to work for your parcel of land. Another item that's sometimes hard to detect early on, but if you certainly know of any wetlands on your parcel, it's really good to understand that may have an impact on the amount of space that's available. And further in the process, full wetland delineation is done during permitting. However, before that, you want to know if that's going to impede on any of the space available. So usually there's a setback, sometimes there's a non-disturbance area, which can cause things like shading and really minimize this amount of space that you have. But just having a handle on that early on to set your expectations on development is really key. And one of the items that people are probably hearing some jargon around is substations and three-phase power. So a site, ultimately, a project needs to tie into three-phase power, and ultimately the three-phase power goes back to a local substation. So when thinking about where your parcel is located, it's good to see if there's three-phase power in the area. But more importantly, when you're working with a developer, it's important to understand if the local substation has any capacity and potentially any projects ahead. It is a first come, first serve basis. So you really want to make sure that there is a path to development for your project, and understanding that uniquely for your project is really key. Your goals are first and foremost the most important. So really get those in line and understand that, you know, it's not a one size fits all solution. Things can be worked around, and there's going to be changes throughout the process. So really advocating, if you have a parcel of land that you want to look at first and use, really work through and push that to understand, you know, the possibilities from all angles of development. Next slide. And since these projects are intended to be in the ground for 20 plus years, it's really important to have a long-term land management plan and some perspectives around goals long-term. So that way you can uniquely figure out how this project's going to work into those. And as Nancy mentioned prior to me jumping on here, the Department of Ag does have those resources, so I'd encourage you to look at those. In addition, Revision Energy has a landowner guide, and what this really does is spell out in detail some of these considerations I have listed here. However, you're able to look at questions to ask too, so I really encourage you to download those and use those to your full advantage when evaluating the opportunity to host a solar farm. And just a few items to call out here, pay attention to. Really honing in on a development timeline from the beginning prior to signing up and moving forward. It's good to have a sense of that. Things can change, and utilities can have different things that come up later on during that process, as well as permitting and environmental review and town approvals. However, just understanding who you're going to be working with, whether that's one company or many companies, and also potentially who the tenant would be, or the person that's going to receive this power or business. So really focusing in on what that relationship will look like for you, and understanding that is key. And you also want to make sure that you can still utilize your land during the development timeframe. So that way, if you have certain goals for, you know, the next growing season or things like that, just working that in to be able to utilize your land is important too. And one of the items that is particularly interesting to pay attention to early on is the taxes. So if you're enrolled in any of the open space or tree growth programs, so these are state programs that are tax advantage if you enroll in them, you want to make sure you're not going to be on the hook for using a solar project or utilizing a solar project on your land. And there are penalties, and every single situation is different. So despite what you might hear from someone else, your situation is going to be probably very unique. So getting a handle on that prior to moving forward is really a necessary step, and you don't want any surprises with that. Same thing with mortgages and easements. You don't want to be surprised by anything. So fully hone in on those. And Nancy mentioned this before, but understanding install methods, decommissioning, and maintenance. So that way, when the project is completed at the end of the term of the lease, you want to make sure that the ground is restored back to its original state prior to starting the project. That's a big item to pay attention to as well. Next slide, please. And this is a farm that's currently under construction, and it's going to be for residential customers in the utility. It's a 35-year-old vegetable farm, and prior to that, it was a dairy farm. There's 120 acres total here that was available, and possibility for a solar project. The landowner really advocated and came to us to say, I want to do a smaller project and utilize land that is not in current operation or integral to the vegetable farm. So we went through, walking the land, understanding what area they wanted to use, and it was a former pasture area that had started to grow up and really wasn't being used for much else. So the project size that seemed right was a 2 megawatt size project, and the footprint was total lease footprint's about 7 acres. It says 6 there. It's in between 6 and 7 acres. So this project will allow the landowner to have income from the project in order to stabilize operating costs. But most important to the landowner was having income and being able to support the taxes and future payments that needed to happen in order to keep the farm and the land for future generations to farm. And I am honestly continually humbled in this position with all the farms that I've been working with and landowners that are not farmers who have a similar mission to try to keep the land working in its current state of agriculture or tree harvesting, and really honing in on a project size that works to support their goals and stabilize those operating costs. Next slide. And under that policy that changed back in 2019, that has started to see these projects pop up and move forward and help farms and landowners too. This is the other side of that outcome, where these 5 towns and school created the first multi-town solar project, and we were able to turn that on in late 2020. So for the next 25 years, these towns and school will be benefiting from clean renewable power, solar power going forward. And this is a pretty awesome thing to see as we move forward in solar policy throughout Maine. Next slide, please. And here's my contact information. Will be available at the end for questions. If you need to contact me, go ahead. And I think Tom will come back on for Ellen.
Great. Thank you so much, Holly. I think it's important to note the interest in both balancing, the profitability of a project and recognizing the importance of the sustainability of the land and protecting the landowner's long-term interests. So that's great. Finally, we have Ellen Griswold, who is the Policy Director at Maine Farmland Trust. Ellen.
Great. Thanks so much, Tom. So as Tom said, I'm the Policy and Research Director at Maine Farmland Trust. Next slide, please. So for those of you who aren't familiar with Maine Farmland Trust, we're a member-powered statewide organization that works to protect farmland, support farmers, and advance the future of farming. Since 1999, when we were established, we have helped to permanently protect nearly 300 farms and over 60,000 acres of farmland in farming, while supporting over 800 farm families with a wide range of services. Our main program areas are farmland protection, farm viability, which is business planning and technical assistance to help farms become and remain economically viable, and then policy and outreach work to really grow the future of farming within the state. Next slide, please. As others have mentioned, about 1.5 years ago, legislation was enacted that really opened the way, paved the way for a large increase in solar development within the state. And at that time, we started getting a lot of calls from farmers who were being approached by solar developers and just had a lot of questions about what this meant for their farm and what it meant for agriculture in general within the state. So I always like to say that when we got involved in this issue, we really needed to figure out what our position was with respect to solar siting farmland. And this slide really sort of represents that position. MFT absolutely believes that solar energy generation and agriculture can coexist in Maine in a mutually beneficial way. We understand that solar projects can be a source of economic support for farms. And we also understand, as Dan was talking about, the importance of solar energy development for Maine meeting its climate goals. But at the same time, we also believe that we really need to make sure that our planning processes and our policies establish the right balance between supporting solar energy production and ensuring that it doesn't displace agricultural production, result in the loss of really important agricultural soils, or really impede land access. So we want to make sure that farmers can continue to not only own, but lease the land that they need, and not be sort of driven away from that land because they can't compete with the lease payments paid by solar developers. Next slide, please. So in order to achieve that balance, about 1.5 years ago, MFT began participating in a solar siting working group that was composed of ag support organizations, solar developers, and environmental organizations to really come together and think through how we sort of incentivize that right balance. Listed on this slide are the different work projects and products that the group worked on. Next slide, please. And one of those work products was coming up with a list of best practices for solar siting, including solar siting on farmland. And we really hope that this list of best practices is a helpful resource for state officials, municipal officials, as well as for developers themselves. And I just wanted to highlight a couple of those best practices, which you see on this slide. The first is sort of talking about what Nancy mentioned before, which is where possible, we really want to try and avoid land that has been identified by the Natural Resources Conservation Service as prime farmland or farmland of statewide importance, because as Nancy described, that's land that's best suited for agriculture and is not, and it is a limited resource within the state. We also want to try and use previously developed or disturbed or marginally productive portions of the farm property. So this could include rooftops, land within and around farmstead areas, sand and gravel pits, or just other areas with real low utility for agricultural production. So we heard from farms, you know, there's a field that they have on their farm that just has never, for whatever reason, it's just never been very good for growing whatever it is that they're producing. And so, you know, a piece of land like that they're not using for farming might be a good place to put a solar project. We also really encourage the use of dual use projects, which Nancy mentioned as well, where agriculture and solar electricity can be produced together on the same piece of land. There are a couple dual use projects that are getting underway, being developed within the state. But there are some really great examples in other states like Massachusetts, New York, other parts of the country. And actually, the US is a little bit late to the sort of dual use development category. So other countries have actually been doing those types of projects for much longer than we have, in particular Japan and the UK and Germany. And a link to our best practices document does appear in your resource materials that Tom mentioned as well. Next slide, please. I also just wanted to mention that in 2011, Maine Farmland Trust partnered with American Farmland Trust and the Maine Watch Institute, which no longer exists, to create a guide about farm-friendly municipal policies that communities in Maine could be thinking about. We're currently working on a revision to that guide, and this slide lists the different components of the guide that we will be updating. And that update will hopefully be available at the end of this year. But I did want to note that the new version of the guide will include information related to the municipal permitting and regulation of solar energy projects, what Holly was talking about before. And so if anyone has any relevant case studies for that section of the guide or relevant information, I would definitely be very interested to hear about that. Next slide, please. MFT also really believes it's important for farmers to have access to the information that they need to make informed decisions about their land. And so we created an information sheet that spells out some of the issues and considerations that landowners should be thinking about when they're considering leasing their land for solar development or when they're trying to evaluate option or lease agreements. As I mentioned, when we started getting the calls from farmers, some of whom were being approached by 12, 13, 14 different developers, and were being presented with various agreements, it was really difficult for them to figure out, what they should be thinking about when they're looking at those. So hopefully this information sheet is helpful in just at least enumerating the topics and categories of issues that they should be thinking about. But we do strongly recommend that farmers and farmland owners consult with an attorney when evaluating any type of document, like I mentioned. And on the information sheet, we list ways that farmers can go about finding a lawyer, including through the Conservation Law Foundation's Legal Food Hub, which provides discounted rates for qualifying farmers and landowners. And a copy of this resource is also included in your resource materials as well. Next slide, please. So this work is ongoing, and I just wanted to highlight some of the policy work that we'll be doing this year to create that balance that we've been talking about. We're really looking forward to seeing the establishment of a solar siting stakeholder group that will be composed of, organizations that work within the agriculture sector, as well as other potentially impacted sectors like forestry and natural lands, along with solar developers and municipal representatives, to really come up with recommendations for how we incentivize the siting of solar projects that minimize or avoid impacts on natural habitats and farmland, agricultural lands, and other forests and other areas like that. As we mentioned, some of the practices that fall, some of the projects that fall within the best practices categories can be more expensive. So thinking through what are ways that we help to make those types of projects more possible. Is it financial incentives for the developers? Is it regulatory efficiency for those types of projects? Or do we think about other options like mitigation funds and that sort of thing? We're hoping that those recommendations can be finalized by the end of this year so that in 2022, we can really try and advance some of those recommendations through the legislative process. We also understand that there will be new legislation this upcoming session that will be focused on a new procurement or solicitation for renewable energy projects. And we're going to be working with farmers to try and include language in that legislation that ensures that those projects are being assessed not only based on ratepayer benefits, which is very important, but also on whether those projects are avoiding or minimizing impacts to natural resources and agricultural lands. And the final bullet on the slide is just a link to sign up for Maine Farmland Trust policy listserv, because we will be sending out regular policy updates and action alerts related to the policy efforts that I just described, as well as with respect to our other policy priorities. Next slide. And I'm happy to answer any questions that you all may have. Thanks so much.
Great, thank you, Ellen. And I think we're going to bring back our entire panel here for a few minutes for any questions or comments. We're going to be looking at the Whova app for any questions or chat that come in. We've had a few that came in earlier. First thing, I just wanted to ask Dan about the timetable for approvals. You know, everything is a proposal or a concept, but it really doesn't take shape until the PUC gives that approval. I think you said that the next round of proposals get submitted to PUC in March. And what do you think the timetable would be after that for actual getting projects starting on the ground?
Yeah, thanks. That's a great question. So that was for the larger, the larger projects, not the 5 megawatts or below that will participate in that. I mean, anyone is eligible to, but those larger ones are likely the ones that will be seen. I don't have an exact timetable. It'll be a couple of months is probably the best way. It depends on how many bids they get and what the process for consideration is for the larger RPS procurements. For the smaller distributed generation, which is causing, you saw the map that was up there before about where things are going. Those are continuing to cycle through and go through a process with the utilities around interconnection, and Holly could speak about that. But there's those types of processes continue to be ongoing, and we're already seeing projects interconnect as a result of the legislation, and more to come in the first few quarters of this year.
Okay, thanks. And I assume that there's some probably very small projects that could be built just on the farm for personal use. It wouldn't require any energy regulatory approval at all. Okay, well, what questions come up about what do we mean by dual use? What are the prime examples of what we would consider good dual use projects? Maybe Ellen?
Yeah, so I can talk about, so we don't have any, because we don't have incentives specific to dual use projects within the state, we don't have sort of any definitive definition that's sort of been developed through regulation within the state. But I would say that our version, when we're talking about dual use projects, we are talking about projects where there is actual agricultural production that's happening in conjunction with the solar production. So some of the, projects you might see are when panels are raised so that certain types of livestock can graze underneath, or when panels are spread apart so that you can have the production of some sort of shade-loving crops, for instance. And so, I know there are people who are, think of dual use more broadly, but for our purposes, since we really want to make sure that agricultural production continues on the farm when there is a solar project there, we want to actually see that production happening, and would advocate for, probably the department to have some role in sort of evaluating or ensuring that if there is some type of incentive for dual use projects, that the agricultural production is actually happening. And that's sort of what happens in other states like Massachusetts that provide incentives for those types of projects.
Great, thanks. I remember at last year's session at the trade show, we heard someone in the audience speak very passionately about their solar grazing business, where they want to offer I believe it was sheep or goats to help do the vegetative maintenance that is necessary. Holly, I'm sure you are aware of requirements to maintain vegetation around your projects. Are you familiar with any solar grazing opportunities in Maine?
Yeah, so Revision will be pursuing grazing this summer. So these projects that have just come under new policy are just starting to get turned on now. And as you can see, it's winter and not much is growing out there. So when that does happen this summer, we're planning on starting out small and dabbling in the sheep grazing on one of our projects. And we're also very committed to exploring other options. So pollinator habitats, bird habitats, and integrating that into our program where we work with different schools for education on this. So keep in mind, these projects are going to be here for a very long time, 25 years. So I think we can test the waters and do it right from the beginning and look to integrate agriculture in all different shapes and forms moving forward.
Okay. Let's see. Nancy, does the department have any grant programs where dual use agriculture projects might be in some way supported?
So there's no particular grant specific for dual use as of right now, but we do have an agricultural marketing loan fund and a dairy improvement fund, both of which are successful and have been around for a long time, and do have the capacity to help assist with on-farm energy projects. So it is worth taking a look at that. It remains to be seen whether or not, because it just hasn't been tested yet, whether that would be compatible with something probably a little bit more, well, what's the word I'm looking for? Not necessarily complicated, but broader from an investment perspective for this type of project. That being said, I'm certainly happy to explore it with those who might be interested. So our agricultural resources development part of our bureau, if folks were to visit our website and look for that, there's lots of web pages about our grants programs, and always reach out to staff to discuss opportunities about that.
I'm sorry, if I could just jump in and also say that while not especially for solar, Efficiency Maine Trust is a fantastic resource for anyone interested in reducing their energy use or making efficient upgrades. So I would really encourage folks to check out what options are available. It won't be necessarily for solar, but you know, everything from on the efficiency umbrella is there. So
Great.
Thanks, Dan. You actually just reminded me, we have a new webpage as well. It's quite complementary to our solar webpage. It's an energy efficiency webpage, and essentially it has lots of great links to opportunities within the state of Maine and elsewhere to help finance upgrades on farm, and even for anyone who's not a farmer too. These are resources that are available regardless of your occupation. So please check out that as a resource too.
We had a question that was posted before our session from the Hoover app on, says, if I own land but am not a farmer, who do I contact about setting up a solar farm? Do we have a list of solar developers? Any suggestions or thoughts?
yeah, so I mean, there is a list of folks engaged on the community solar side on the Public Advocate and PUC's webpage. So I think that could be a place to start. I've not heard of the concern of landowners needing to find developers. It's typically been the other way around. So I don't know if Holly has thoughts on the best way to go about that.
Yeah, we have a booth here. I don't know if there's any other developers here too, but definitely check that out and look at the resources there.
Great. We're at the end of our time. So I want to thank all of our panelists for participating today. And I do want to remind you that the Ag Trade Show, although it theoretically ends this week, it will be online through June. So if you want to dialogue with any of our panelists, or if you want to create a meetup with other people who might be interested in solar grazing or any of the topics that we're talking about, please feel free to go to the Ag Trade Show Hoover app and use those resources, because we really want to carry on this dialogue for as long as you have questions and interest in this topic. So I think we're at the end of our time. Thank you all for watching. There's going to be more great stuff coming from the Ag Trade Show. Again, thank you to our panelists. Have a great afternoon. Bye-bye.
Thanks for having me.
Thank you.